Our topic for this presentation is GDP. If you don't know what GDP is, let me tell you. This is the GDP definition. Gross domestic product, known as GDP, is the total monetary or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders within a specific time period. This indicator is most often found by using the expenditure approach with the formula denoted below. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus XN. C stands for consumption, which is the purchase of goods or services. I equals private domestic investments, which is the purchase of equipment, real estate, or inventory by a business. G is government spending. Examples would be infrastructure, such as the maintenance of roads and buildings, healthcare for the general population, and defense, such as the military. XN is net exports, which is the value of exports minus the value of imports.
So as for how COVID has affected GDP, it's actually caused the biggest blow to the economy since the Great Depression, and that was all the way back in 1929. So that says a lot about the magnitude of coronavirus and its effects on GDP. A lot of businesses were forced to close during this time, and that obviously harmed their sales. They weren't able to work as normal. The GDP actually dropped at an annual rate of 32.9%. And that's the deepest decline since records began back in 1947. So again, you can tell how much of an impact COVID had on GDP. The economy was down 9.5% smaller in the second quarter than it was during that time in the previous year. Even though activity started picking up in May, momentum continued to slow at the increase of COVID-19 infections. A lot more people were getting sick, and authorities in certain hard-hit areas had to close businesses again and pause reopenings. So again, a lot of businesses, restaurants, they had limitations. They couldn't perform as normal, and they weren't getting the same amount of income that they normally would. As you can see on the slideshow, 30.2 million Americans received unemployment checks by the beginning of June. The government spent a lot of money trying to help out people that were really affected by Corona and whose businesses were also affected. The central bank kept interest rates low and continued to help the economy. They actually kept interest rates near zero. So here you can see the GDP change in comparison to the business cycle peak. You can see many of the other recessions on the side, all color coded, but clearly the purple one, 2020, sticks out with that sharp decline. And again, this just reiterates how much of an effect COVID had on GDP.
So for my part of the presentation, I did GDP growth percentage prior to COVID-19 for the years of 2015 to 2019. This graph shows the GDP growth percentage compared to the previous year at the bottom. So while GDP was still increasing for every year, it increased less in the years 2019 and 2016 when compared to the previous year. Since the US is the largest economy in the world, there are many different factors that affect the GDP growth in a given year. But from an economic perspective, there weren't any major events in these years that would have affected the GDP growth that much, aside from like a shift in policy when Trump was elected in 2016. Economists believe that the ideal GDP growth rate is between 2% and 3%, with growth at least 3% to maintain a natural rate of unemployment. 2015 and 2017 and 2018 have increasing growth rates when compared to their previous years. And this time period accurately depicts how, under normal circumstances, GDP will rise and fall given a number of different factors, such as technological development, a society's tendency for leisure, government political influences, or economic inequality.
The expectations for the future of the GDP. So in the past year, because of COVID-19, the GDP has decreased significantly. This is mainly because since the pandemic started, everyone was pretty much forced to go into lockdown. So people were staying inside and they weren't going out as much, and therefore they weren't spending much, which means that the GDP would not increase or even decrease, which it did. So for the future of the GDP in 2021, it is expected that it will expand about 3.5%. And this is after the estimated 3.6 contraction that it had in 2020, which means that after all said and done, because of the pandemic, we are only about 0.1% growth below where we were in the beginning of 2020, because we decreased 3.6% and now we are expected to increase by 3.5%. We're expecting this increase mainly because of COVID-19 vaccines. These are coming out and they're becoming a lot more accessible to everyone, which means that restaurants and shopping centers are going to open back up and people are going to feel more comfortable going out and spending their money. And that means that the GDP is going to increase.
So though the GDP saw a drop in the beginning of 2020 with the coronavirus pandemic, it's actually predicted to go much higher than it has ever been in the coming years, as we are now currently coming out of this recession. But as you can see on this slide, we have a graph from Forbes, and it's predicting the potential future of the GDP. So as you can see, the dotted line in it is the coming years. And if you look at this projection, we could hit $20 trillion in around 2022. And if we stay on this course, it could be hitting up to 21 trillion, 22 trillion in the next few years coming after that. And then these are our resources for everything that we used in this PowerPoint.